committee does not expect that it will be appropriate to reduce the target range until it has gained greater confidence that inflation is moving sustainably toward 2%.
Fed Chair Powell still expects rate cuts this year, or does he? I'm Lisa Bernhard with Reuters, and I'm joined today by Melissa Brown. She is Managing Director of Applied Research at SimCorp. Melissa, Jerome Powell, U.S. Federal Reserve Chair, spoke today in front of the House Financial Services Committee. He indicated that rate cuts would be coming this year, tempered it a bit, though, by saying that inflation would have to be tamed. For a guy who's been pretty consistent in his messaging, did anything unusual jump out to you in his language today? What do you think?
The language and the comments that I saw today, I did not notice anything unusual. Where I did see something that was a little bit more unusual was the reaction of traders that we can see through the CME FedWatch tool. And although the difference was slight, they seem to have increased their probability that the rate cut would come sooner rather than later. So it went up a little bit from the probability we saw yesterday. And that was a little surprising to me because he also, he talked about the strength in the economy and, jobs growth looking good. And so I was surprised that even though the increase was small, that we saw any increase.
I wanted to point this out, and that is that the committee chairman, Patrick McHenry, a Republican, noted that everything the Fed does would be seen through the lens of the November rematch between Trump and Biden. Now, maybe that's political posturing, but the Fed is supposed to be apolitical. Presumably, a strong economy would benefit an incumbent, and a weaker economy, perhaps Trump. What is the relationship between the Fed and the election when clearly they have politicians from both sides in their collective ear, wanting things various ways? How do they balance that? How do they walk that line?
I mean, that's exactly the case. You have politicians on both sides. So basically, they're damned if they do and damned if they don't. But it seems to me that since, you've got this choice, they're probably just going to do what they would have done anyway, which is if inflation comes down, they'll start to ease. If inflation stays stubbornly high, they probably won't. And hopefully, and I've seen reports that among central banks, the Fed is one of the ones that's considered to be much more independent of the political process than maybe we see in some other countries. So my guess is they're going to do what they do based on the data, which is what he says all the time anyway.
If the data suggests that they should not start cutting rates until the fourth quarter, do you think that they will do that given how close that is to the election?
I think they will. I mean, I think they've got the health of the economy as their first priority. And that is measured by jobs, it's measured by inflation and so on. And I suspect if they don't think they need to cut, because we continue to be in a strong economy, they're not going to cut.
Lots of talk about the Fed achieving a soft landing, a sort of Goldilocks scenario versus a hard landing, a recession. But what about no landing? What are the chances of that? Explain what that is and how markets might react in that scenario.
Well, I think no landing would be continued growth in GDP, hopefully continued strong jobs numbers and so on. But I think the absolute measure is what happens to GDP. And if we don't see we might see a slowdown, but if it doesn't turn negative, that would be considered to be no landing because we didn't actually land. A soft landing, on the other hand, might be, a slight downturn in the economy. And of course, a hard landing would be, a big downturn. And all of these would have to last for 2 quarters or more. So, we're somewhere, I think, between no landing and a soft landing. And, right now we haven't landed yet.
Which is the scenario in which markets perform well?
Well, that's a really interesting question. We've done some stress testing on markets, making some assumptions about what happens to interest rates and inflation and corporate profits and so on under various scenarios. And what we found actually is that probably the best scenario is a soft landing, because in a soft landing, we would see rates come down. We probably would see inflation continue to ease. Corporate profits might, stall out a little bit, but they're not going to be down substantially. And so because of the lower rates and lower inflation, that typically is good for equity markets. Interestingly, a no landing scenario in which we don't see any rate cuts, rates in fact could go higher, inflation may stay even higher than it is now, that would actually be relatively bad news for equity markets, which seems a little counterintuitive, but I think it's really that connection between interest rates and what happens to the stock market that's critically important.